Okay, so what we're going to do right now is we're going to learn how to create complex driven key sets. So what we really want to do is create some poses that are going to make it easy to control the hand. So if I wanted to come in and animate each one of these individually, I could of course select all of these, and let's just hit S and we'll set a keyframe and select these. And then I would have to go, let's say, to frame 10, and then I would have to animate each one of my fingers into place individually. And every time I wanted to animate my hand poses, I would have to come in and do this same process. Now I will select all of my fingers here individually and hit S, which is a set key. So there we go. Now, imagine how long it would take to animate a series of hand postures or poses, or do a complex animation that involved hand animations with this technique, just animating every single finger joint. And this guy's only got 2 fingers and a thumb. Imagine you have 5 fingers and a thumb in a human. Right, it would take a long time. So what we want to do is use our ability to create custom sliders and generate hand poses that we can then control and animate very quickly and easily. So I'm just going to select all of these. I think that I have them all selected, and I'm going to delete my keyframes here. There we go. So just getting rid of that animation data. Okay, so now what I'm going to do is we're going to create kind of what we call a proxy node, or a node that's like a marionette. We're going to create a marionette node that's going to control all of the hand poses of these fingers and do it from one single entity. So I'm going to use what's called a locator. So I'm going to go to Create, and let's create a locator. Now a locator, it's right down here, it's very small. I'm going to scale this up so we can see it. Alright, a locator is basically a crosshair. It's a transform node that has this little check or crosshair. We call it an ornament, which is something that we can see in the 3D view, but we can't actually render it. It's a helper object. Alright, and these objects allow us to put a bunch of stuff on them, control different objects with various channels and things that we custom rig to our specific needs. Alright, so what I'm going to do with this locator here is I'm going to snap it, vertex snap it, to my wrist here. And the reason is so that it will generate our hand poses and it's close to the hand. It's kind of just a visual representation of a node. It doesn't really have to be here. I don't care where it is. It's just a node with a collection of attributes that I'm going to generate. Okay, so now if I want it to move with my arm, and generally we do, we want to kind of see this as a visual representation of how we're going to control the hand. I'm going to select my wrist here, and I'm going to select my locator. I'm going to go to constrain, and I'm going to use a point constraint. I'm going to use a point constraint because I don't really need to use anything more complex than this point constraint. Wherever this wrist is, right, the locator will be. So I can rotate my, oops, looks like I did not do that properly. Well, I see what happened is I did not have, let's just go here and delete our constraint. I'm going to do that one more time because I didn't have my constraint settings set properly. So I'm going to constrain point, and I had left some settings in here previously. We want to constrain all axes here. Right, there we go. Now if I rotate my elbow, right, you can see that our locator moves with it. It does not rotate with it. It doesn't really need to rotate with it. If you want it to rotate with it, you would use a parent constraint. Okay, but all I need to do is just select it wherever it is. Alright, now the important thing here is that I create my own custom sliders. See, all these are basically sliders, these virtual sliders. I can create my own custom attribute, and I can make it anything I want. So let's just call this left underscore hand underscore control. Hit enter, and I'm going to go to my attribute editor. There we go, here's the attribute editor. Now I'm going to make sure that I select left hand control the transform node. I don't want to select the shape node. I want to select the transform node. Because when I put this custom attribute in here, it's going to show up in the channel box if I have it under the transform node. So I'm going to go to attributes, and I'm going to click on add attribute. Now I'm going to name this, and we'll just call this left. We always say left and right so that we know which attribute is which, and that's in case we need to script these or animate them by typing in text. Okay, so I'm going to call this left hand, and we'll just call this fist. That's one hand pose we're going to create. All right, our data type here will be float. That means it's a value between 0 and 1. It has decimal points. All right, and now our minimum value will be 0, maximum value will be 1, and the default value will be 0. That creates a slider from 0 to 1, or from 0 to 100%. It doesn't matter if it's 0 to 100 or 0 to 1, because it doesn't mean anything. It's simply a bunch of numbers in a range. Now I'm going to go ahead and click on Add. And you can see here, under Extra Attributes, it creates this little slider for you. All right, now because I know that I'm going to have 2 more of these hand poses, I'm just going to type in left underscore hand underscore point and same values. Click on Add here. Let's say left underscore hand underscore, and the other one will be our peace sign. Just so we get a range of poses we can put this hand in. And let's close it. So now we have 3 range sliders, just like a little slider, just like it's a volume pedal or a volume knob. Now we don't have anything connected to it yet, so it doesn't really do anything. So now what we want to do is create our custom individual poses for these fingers, and we want to create all of the finger poses, control them with a single slider or a single node. It's going to make things really easy when we animate this guy. So here's our locator, we're going to call left hand control. Here's our custom sliders. Now we're going to open up our driven key editor. So I'm going to deselect everything, because once again, deselecting everything ensures that when I bring up this animate set driven key set window, that nothing is preloaded, and that just keeps us from getting confused between what is the driver and what is the driven. Alright, so now what is my driver? Well, it's the hand control which I just created. It's my locator. I'm going to click on Load Driver. Okay, now what is my driven? Well, in this case we have several driven objects. It's all the joints in the hand, or all the joints that we're going to rotate in the hand. Right, so let's select here. Now it's not going to be the wrist itself, but it's going to be our finger joints. So I'm going to add select each one of my driven objects, and I'm not going to select the ends here. Now remember, when you select a joint, you don't select the entire, you don't select the root in each chain here. You actually select every single joint that you're going to rotate. And I click on Load Driven, and you can see here all the joints selected. Now one thing about the set driven key window is that you must create all your selections at once and then load them into driven. If I go back and say click on this and say load driven, now unfortunately it will remove the set that I've already loaded in there. So especially when you have multiple joints, this becomes kind of a pain, and you want to make sure you not only get them all right, but don't actually accidentally mess them up here. So you want to make sure you have everything selected in this window before we move on to the next step, which is saying, okay, now let's create the 0 pose. Let's choose, first of all, what channel we'll be driving with. And let's just say the fist. That will be one of our sliders that we're going to control, one of our poses that we're going to generate. Okay, now what are we controlling? All right, so we have all these fingers. Now, generally speaking, this will be the rotate. Now, because fingers have, not all, because some of our joints and fingers, especially these joints up here, have rotations that go both on one axis here on the Y and another on the Z, we're going to need to control more than just one rotate axis. Now this particular finger joint here only rotates on the Z axis, but I don't really want to have to figure out exactly which one is going to rotate on exactly which axis. So if I want to make my life a little bit easier, I just say rotate X, Y, and Z. And I'm going to control all 3 rotation channels for all of these joints with one single slider. And this is the real power of driven keys, is that I can do 25 things with one thing. And then when I go back to animate, I only have to change the value for a few sliders that are between 0 and 1. Very easy to animate, very easy to see the values between 0 and 1. I don't have to rotate, do all these weird rotates on various channels. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and create my initial state. And here is the guy in his mind pose. This is the initial state, the 0 state. And we're going to click on key. Now you'll see that all of these fingers, the joints will have red highlighted channels here. Click on our channel box, and that indicates that they have a keyframe of some kind. And remember, our driven keys actually create animation curves, and we'll look at that in a second just to see that it creates an animation curve based on value to value. Okay, so that's my 0 point. And one thing about this driven key window is if you select in this window here, if you click on this text box, it will actually select the object, so it makes it easy to switch back and forth. Alright, so here's our initial state. Now we need to turn our virtual slider that we've created to its final state, or its end state. So here, this left-hand fist, right, we set it to 0. Our initial state here is at 0. Now we must set it to 1. And if you like using the actual slider, you can click on the attribute editor and slide it to 1. Okay, now what happens when left-hand fist is turned to 1? Well, we should see our character actually make a fist. And when I'm doing a fist, the thumb has 2 planes of rotation here, and this guy is not incredibly dense polygonally, and I have not set up the skin weights on him very well because it would take a while, and this particular bind is kind of loosely done. So I'm going to kind of loosely create a fist, and his fingers are really kind of odd, and they're very long and weird looking. So I have to kind of figure out what would he look like when generating fists, and see how I'm rotating these in 2 axes. And it doesn't matter, I can rotate them in 3 axes if I want. I can do pretty much whatever I want in that regard because, yeah, and this obviously, skin weights need to be edited there, so pay no attention to the broken finger. But I can basically rotate these on 3 axes. So we can tighten up. And I'm just kind of grabbing each joint. As long as we don't mess around with this, we can just grab these joints at will and change them. So let's get those 2 fingers done. And now his thumb kind of swivels down because we have that opposable thumb, so we're going to kind of swivel it down a little bit. And I'm just going down the hierarchy here so I can fold that thumb in so it kind of looks like it's folding on top of that finger and holding it into place. And this is kind of a fist. This is about as good of a fist as we're going to get this guy. And the point is just to kind of show you how to use the driven keys. We're not doing anything really fancy with this. Okay, so here's our fist shape, right? Now we have this in the slider position of 1. We have these all set up to be as close to the fist as we're going to get with this. And now we must click key again. This creates the second key of the pose. If we don't click that again and we go back to 0, we will lose that position, right? But now we preserved it, and now the slider goes from bind pose, initial pose, to fist. And the nice thing about this is that I can now, if I'm animating this, I can actually start this at a value of somewhere in between, and now it looks like it's kind of in a relaxed pose. So I get to use the entire range from 0 to 1 of where those joints are going to rotate. So I can simply start it from here and say, okay, it's more natural. It's kind of a natural flexed finger pose for this guy. Okay, so let's do this one more time. And this time, we're going to make our life a little bit easier, and we're going to use the point. And a point will simply have this finger be able to point in the line of the wrist and the elbow. So we're going to now make sure we select our left-hand point channel. So we're going to be animating or editing with this slider here now. And all of these will remain the same. We're controlling the same channels from the same joints with a different slider. And the cool thing about the driven keys is that we can blend these together and mix and match our poses. It doesn't always give us the best results, and when animating, you'll see it can really screw things up. But it still is pretty powerful when you're doing things like face animation. Alright, so once again, make sure you set your 0 pose. The left-hand point is at 0, and this is at its initial resting or its bind pose, which is its initial state. We will click key. Okay, now, the next important step, and if you miss this, if you happen to go set up his left-hand point state without using this slider, you will lose all that information, so you'll have to do it again. And you'll think you're spending all this time working on setting these into the right order, and then what happens is you'll change this value here, and it'll go away. So we need to make sure we slide that onto 1. And now we will create a pointed hand pose. Once again, I hate that broken finger there, and I promise myself often that I will fix that, and then I promptly forget 5 minutes after I promise myself that I will do that. Alright, so once again, let's swivel that opposable thumb. And I'm kind of using my arrow keys to go down the hierarchy here. It makes life a little easier. And then let's use that thumb to hold in that finger there. And if you put your finger into a point position, you'll see that our thumb kind of does hold that finger in, because our fingers kind of naturally have a tendency to spring open. It's actually hard to keep this finger completely straight while keeping all the rest of your fingers folded. It's just part of the anatomy. And let's change this a little bit. And I'm making these selections because of the selection priority, which I'm sure you're aware of. If I just click on the area above the geometry where the joint is, it will prioritize the joint itself and select that. And I'm going to make this even more dramatic. I'm going to zip this up a little bit, make it float upwards slightly, just to emphasize that point. Alright, and now we created our point pose. And now let's click on key again. And if I select this left-hand control here, I'll bring up the attribute editor. Now we can see initial pose and with our left-hand point on. Okay, so now, if you notice, we can also mix and match these two. So I can have these partially on, partially off, and maybe he pointed and now he goes to kind of a relaxed pose. And I can animate these. So let's start out our pose in kind of natural. I'm going to go ahead and close this. Now, the reason we're doing all this stuff and creating these poses is so that we can animate it, us, or if we're the rigger, we're going to hand this to an animator, and we're going to have a really cool, simple marionette type system for our animator to animate, which in some cases is us. So I'm just going to go ahead and hit set, and S is my shortcut key, and if you notice this turns green, this is because I did something that's a little silly, and I set a keyframe on what is being controlled by a constraint that I have, and this is why using the S key is oftentimes dangerous, because it will set keyframes for everything, not taking into account that you have other things controlling this. So really what I need to do is the right way and not the lazy person's way, and I need to select all these, right click, and say key selected, because I'm only changing this right here. Okay, so now let's go to frame 10. Let's say we want to create a fist. Alright, let's create a fist, and I will key select it. Alright, so here's the fist. Now we go from fist, let's just go to frame 20, and now I want him to point. And maybe I don't want it to be quite so dramatic of a point, and I mix and match these values just a little bit, and go ahead and click on key selected. So, in a very short time, and you'll notice here, when mixing and matching these, you see how we get a little bit of a problem here. Sometimes this is problematic, and what's happening is the value, let's go back to frame 10. Sometimes when you mix and match these, especially when you deal with joint rotations, it does some pretty bizarre things. So it probably is a little bit better idea at this point. And what I probably forgot to do is make sure that at this frame 10, the point is set to 0. So let's just go key selected there. So fist, and there we go. And we made a transition between two poses, which would have been very, very complex to individually tweak and animate. And now they're essentially just a matter of sliding two values from 0 to 1, or a mix of those two, and setting keyframes for them. So that is how you create some custom sliders and generate complex poses from bone rotations and mash them to that simple slider. And this is basically the essence of rigging. We're controlling a lot of complex things with one single slider or a simple controller.